The room went dead silent when she touched the fall line. Elena Martinez didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know that the way her fingers moved, one smooth rotation of the saline drip, a precise adjustment of the flow rate to 120 milliliters per hour, a single practiced glance at the digital readout, would lodge itself in Dr. Ashford's memory like a splinter he couldn't remove. He stood beyond the observation window on the third floor of Seattle General's ICU ward, his arms crossed, his jaw tightening as he watched her hands move with the kind of efficiency that didn't match the plain scrubs and the nervous badge clipping he'd seen in the break room 5 minutes earlier. Most nurses fumbled a little. Most nurses asked questions. Elena Martinez simply moved, her shoulders squared, her breathing steady, as if her body remembered things her mouth had never spoken aloud. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp, metallic bite that lives in every ICU corridor across every city in America, but here it was different. Here it carried weight. Seattle General's private ward smelled like the particular kind of silence that settles over the rooms of people who've been waiting for 2 years. 2 years of machines breathing for them. 2 years of families who stopped visiting after the first 6 months, when hope calcified into routine. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous frequency, the kind of sound that becomes white noise if you let it, unless you've been trained to hear the difference between one hum and another, between normal and wrong. Elena stepped into Marine General Robert Kincaid's private room at 06 for 5 hours, her badge clipped precisely at nipple height, her scrubs creased at the shoulders in a way that suggested her hand still remembered how to fold things into military precision. The general lay in the center of the bed, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, his face a map of 2 years of unresponsiveness. Skin pale as hospital gauze. Eyes closed. 48 hours of stubble on a jaw that had once commanded 214 Marines through the western corridors of Bagram airfield, back when Elena's son had been alive and her name hadn't been burned out of the service records like a redaction pen had scrubbed away her entire existence. She didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She checked the ventilator settings, parameters all running 3 to 5 units higher than they should have been, and made a mental note of the discrepancy without changing anything. Not yet. Not with Dr. Ashford's silhouette visible through the observation window glass. The dog tag on the broken chain beneath her scrubs pressed cold against her ribs, metal against skin, a weight she'd carried for 11 years and 4 months. She touched it through the fabric without thinking, her hand moving to that familiar spot above her heart the way people touch crucifixes in foxholes, the way soldiers touch the names of the dead when they think nobody's watching. The thing about muscle memory is that it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't check your current job title or your psychiatric evaluations or the 3-inch scar tissue hidden beneath the long sleeves you wear even in July. Elena's hands adjusted the fore-pump with the kind of competence that came from holding tourniquets tight while mortars screamed overhead, from working by headlamp inside a collapsed safe house in Loga Province while the world outside smelled like diesel and burned copper. Her fingers found the pressure points on the line with no wasted motion, the kind of precision that separated field surgeons from people who'd just watched videos online. She didn't look down. She didn't have to. Her hands already knew. Dr. Ashford's reflection in the observation window glass shifted. He moved his weight from his left foot to his right, a small tell that Elena caught peripherally without turning her head. His presence in that hallway felt like pressure changes before a storm, the kind of atmospheric weight that made dogs hide and birds go silent. He was competent in the way that threatened people usually weren't. He wasn't loud. He wasn't crude. He was the kind of antagonist who made phone calls instead of speeches, who wielded institutional policy like other men wielded fists. Seattle General's ICU had been his kingdom for the past 16 months. His standing orders. His staff. His rules. And now there was a new nurse in the private ward who moved like she'd been trained by someone who still had access to classified funding. Elena checked the general's pupil response, reactive and equal, though that meant nothing after 2 years of pharmaceutical coma, and then she turned to face the observation window directly. Just for a moment. Just long enough to make eye contact with the silhouette on the other side of the glass. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply looked, the way soldiers look at each other across a distance, a recognition that passed between two people who both understood that something important had just shifted in the balance of power. The general's daughter had stopped visiting after month 7. The Marine Corps had sent a protocol officer to explain why the general's service record couldn't be discussed. The Pentagon had buried 3 investigations under classification levels that required signatures from people Elena would never meet. But the body in front of her, this man who had commanded her son in the mountains of Bagram, who had made decisions that shaped operations she could never speak about, who carried knowledge that someone wanted kept unconscious forever, the body in front of her was breathing on a machine set to parameters that didn't match his medical profile. Elena moved through the rest of her vital signs check with the kind of systematic precision that came from habit. Heart rate, 62, steady. Respiratory rate, 14, assisted. Oxygen saturation, 98%. Blood pressure, 128/74. Everything was stable. Everything was wrong. The medications on the chart told a story that her training immediately translated: lorazepam dosed at 8 mg every 6 hours, propofol at rates that climbed and descended in patterns that made no neurological sense, sedatives stacked in combinations that suggested someone was actively working to keep this man's consciousness submerged. Not treating him. Keeping him under. She knew because she'd seen it before. Not in Seattle. Not in peacetime. In a field hospital outside Jalabad, where casualties who'd seen things nobody wanted documented were kept in pharmaceutical darkness. She'd been 23 years old then. She'd had a rank and a name and dog tags that weren't broken. She'd had the authority to ask questions. She'd had the clearance to know the answers. That was a different lifetime. The morning shift change happened at 0700. Elena moved through the ward corridors like she belonged there, her shoes making soft tapping sounds on the linoleum tile, her badge occasionally clinking against the metal of the supply cart she pushed. The ICU never truly quieted. There was always the sound of monitors beeping in their individual rhythms, a polyrhythmic symphony of survival and decline. She counted the heartbeats as she moved, one patient's monitor singing a steady rhythm, another skipping occasionally like a record with a scratch. These were the sounds that had become more familiar to her than her own pulse. By 09:30 hours, she'd familiarized herself with the entire ward. 16 beds. 12 occupied. For patients who'd been unresponsive for longer than a year. General Kincaid was the only private room. The only one guarded by observation glass and a restricted access list. The only one whose medical records required a secondary password that Elena had watched the previous nurse use at 0800, a password she'd memorized without trying, the way her brain still worked like a machine calibrated for survival in hostile environments. She was reaching for the supply cabinet in the nursing station when Dr. Ashford appeared beside her, his voice carrying the kind of casual condescension that predators use before they strike. Just so you understand the protocol, Ms. Martinez, General Kincaid requires minimal stimulation. Your job is basic care monitoring. Vital signs. Equipment maintenance. Nothing more. His eyes moved across her face the way someone reads a painting they've already decided they don't like. I trust that's clear. Elena didn't look at him. She didn't let her jaw tighten. She simply nodded once, a small economical motion, and pulled the supply cabinet open with her left hand while her right remained steady against the edge of the counter. Understood, Doctor. The use of his title was deliberate. The shortness of her response was a message. The way she didn't repeat back his instructions, acknowledging them instead, was the kind of thing that would stay with Dr. Ashford for exactly as long as it took him to understand that something about this nurse didn't match her file. Her employment application had listed 12 years in civilian hospitals. Her references were stellar but unremarkable. Her credentials were current and her background check had cleared, though he'd noticed the slight delay in processing, the kind of administrative pause that suggested something had been redacted from her history. What he didn't know was that Elena Martinez had spent the first part of her morning shift not just checking vitals, but photographing the medication logs with her phone held at her chest, the kind of angle that looked like she was adjusting her badge. What he didn't know was that her hands had remembered everything, not just how to move with precision, but how to observe without being seen observing. How to document without writing anything down. How to carry classified information in the architecture of her own muscle memory. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd recognized something in General Kincaid's eyes, even closed as they were. The kind of recognition that came from shared history. From being the only two people in a room who understood what it meant when operations got classified, when service records got burned, when the Pentagon decided that certain soldiers needed to disappear so thoroughly that even their families stopped remembering their names. Elena had disappeared once. She'd come back to the surface by becoming someone else entirely. She'd learned how to be invisible while standing in plain sight. General Kincaid had been her commanding officer's superior. She'd never spoken to him. She'd never been introduced. But her son had been in his unit. Her son had died in his zone of operations. And the fact that he was unconscious in Seattle General while someone kept him sedated meant that he'd seen something. He'd witnessed something. He'd walked into something. And Elena Martinez had just arrived at exactly the moment someone needed him to wake up. She finished her morning checks by 10:30 hours, documented everything in the system without anomaly, and then she sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that tasted like rust water and thought about whether she was about to burn what was left of her life, or finally reclaim it. The broken dog tag chain pressed against her ribs like a countdown timer. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Ashford was making a note about the new nurse's unusual familiarity with critical care protocols. Somewhere in the general's unconscious mind, his body was processing medications that someone very important had decided needed to keep him locked in artificial sleep. Elena Martinez had become very good at waiting. But she had never learned how to do nothing while people she'd loved were being erased from the world. The fluorescent overhead lights cast everything in clinical white as Elena pushed the general's chart back into the slot at the foot of his bed. His daughter Rebecca sat in the visitor's chair, reading to him from a worn copy of his favorite Clancy novel, a ritual she'd maintained for 730 days, waiting for eyes that wouldn't open, ears that wouldn't hear. Elena was adjusting the ventilator tubing when Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway like a storm front moving in from the sound. "Nurse Martinez." His voice carried the particular coldness of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why you were accessing pharmaceutical logs from neurology without authorization." The question hung in the recycled air. Rebecca's book lowered. Elena didn't flinch. She'd found the discrepancies at 2:02 a.m. during her shift, sedative patterns that made no medical sense. Propofol ordered at irregular intervals. Lorazepam doses spiking whenever the general's EEG showed improvement. As if someone was deliberately keeping him unconscious. She'd pulled the records to understand why, and now Ashford was making it a crime. "I read charts," Elena said, meeting his eyes, "because I care if my patients wake up." The words came out level, measured, a voice like still water. "Do you?" She let one tear trace her cheek, deliberate and controlled, then wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. The tear was theater, but theater worked. It made her look human. It made her look breakable. Ashford's jaw tightened. His hands clenched at his sides. "What I care about, Nurse Nobody, is that you stay in your lane." He turned to Rebecca. "My apologies, Ms. Kincaid. Hospital policy. Nothing to concern yourself with." Then he was gone, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of finality. Rebecca stared after him. "Who does he think he is?" "A doctor," Elena said, returning to the ventilator. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That's the entire problem. The next morning, Elena found her name posted on the unit disciplinary board in the main hallway, printed in stark Times New Roman, visible to every nurse, every resident, every attending who passed through. The notation read, * written warning, insubordination and overreach, Elena Martinez star. Two residents whispered as she read it. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge them. She simply waited for the moment to pass, then moved on. By Tuesday lunch, the isolation had crystallized. Elena sat at the break room table with her container of leftover salmon and quinoa, and three nurses, Yuki, Marcus, and Jennifer, grabbed their trays and left within seconds, conversation dying mid-sentence like a radio switched off. They didn't meet her eyes. Nobody did. In hospitals, professional ostracism was a particular kind of weapon because it looked like nothing on the surface. It was just people choosing other tables. It was just schedules that didn't align. It was just the way things happened to work out. Elena ate alone, tasting neither the salmon nor the salt. On Wednesday, Ashford reassigned her to the night shift, effective immediately. Night shift meant she'd lose her proximity to the general during the daylight hours when medical rounds happened, when decisions were made, when she could observe the patterns of his care. The reassignment notice appeared in her mailbox with no explanation, just a line that read, *staffing adjustment, effective immediately*. She recognized the move for what it was, strategic. Ashford wasn't trying to destroy her. He was trying to move her out of sight. Out of reach. Out of the way of whatever he was protecting. That evening, she discovered her access to the general's medication records had been restricted. Her credentials were still valid, but the system blocked her at the digital door. She tried twice, just to confirm it wasn't an error. The second attempt flagged in the network logs. Within an hour, her phone buzzed with an email from hospital IT, *access denied, contact your supervisor*. She understood now. Ashford wasn't just angry about her chart access. He was terrified of it. Elena stood in the supply room later that week, counting the 14-gauge angiocath needles and running the numbers in her head. She'd worked ICU for 847 consecutive shifts without a disciplinary mark. She'd mentored 23 junior nurses through code blues. She'd held the hands of 641 patients at the moment between life and whatever came next. And now she was being quietly erased from the unit where she mattered most, restricted, isolated, pushed into night shifts where she could do nothing but monitor vitals and document what was already written. The medications kept coming. Every time the general's brain activity improved even slightly, a flicker on the EEG, a spontaneous eye movement toward sound, Ashford ordered another sedative within hours. Propofol at 0300. Lorazepam at 0600. A fresh order before dawn, before the day shift could notice the pattern. Before the general could wake up. I need some jello, Elena thought, and almost smiled at her own dark humor. Except jello required a functioning swallow reflex, and Ashford was making damn sure the general never got that far. She was reviewing the medication logs from a printout she'd smuggled home on her personal phone when her doorbell rang at 9:44 p.m. on Friday. Elena opened the door to find Rebecca Kincaid standing in the hallway outside her apartment, mascara smudged, eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Can I come in?" Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. Elena stepped aside without a word. Rebecca sat on the edge of the couch like she might shatter, and then she asked the question that made everything stop, "Do you think someone is keeping my father unconscious?" Elena didn't answer. She walked to her bedroom, retrieved the photographs she'd taken of the medication orders, printed them on her home printer, and laid them on the coffee table in chronological order. She pointed to the timestamps. She showed Rebecca the pattern, improvement, then suppression. Always suppression. Always Ashford's signature at the bottom. Rebecca's hands trembled as she looked at the evidence. Why would he do this? Because, Elena said, her voice dropping into a register she hadn't used since leaving active duty, your father knows something someone very powerful once kept quiet. And the easiest way to keep a witness silent is to keep them asleep. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain beginning to fall outside, hammering the Seattle streets like applause nobody wanted. Rebecca looked up at Elena, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "What do we do?" Rebecca asked. Elena thought of the general in his ICU bed, sedated and trapped. She thought of the 2 years he'd already lost. She thought of the dog tag she kept in her locker, the broken chain still waiting to be repaired. "We wait," Elena said. "We gather evidence. And we prepare for what happens when this stops being a hospital problem and becomes something much bigger." She didn't tell Rebecca about the classified operation. She didn't mention Bagram or asset extractions or the night her entire service record had been burned and buried under 6 layers of secrecy. She didn't explain why she recognized the architecture of a cover-up so well that she could predict Ashford's next move before he made it. But as Rebecca looked at those medication logs, Elena knew they were past the point of small battles now. What had started as a suspicion about a single patient's care was about to become a much larger reckoning. Ashford had made his first strategic move, and he had no idea who he was standing next to. Elena sat in the break room at 11:56 p.m., a stack of shift reports spread across the table in front of her like a confession she was about to make to herself. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual electronic dirge overhead. She'd requested these records 3 days ago, ostensibly for a quality assurance review, nothing unusual, just a nurse doing her job. The charge nurse had handed them over without question. Now, in the silence of the empty break room, Elena cross-referenced medication administration times with the staffing schedule taped to the refrigerator door. Ashford worked Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and occasional nights. She traced a finger down the columns. The general sedative doses, propofol at 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, then fentanyl boluses every 6 hours, correlated with Ashford's shifts with the precision of a ballistic trajectory. When Ashford wasn't on duty, the medication intervals shifted. Longer gaps. Lower doses. The general's pupils would dilate slightly, his EEG pattern showed the smallest flutter of cognitive activity. Then Ashford would return, write new orders, and the sedation deepened into a pharmaceutical void. Elena's hands, steady as surgical steel, photographed each page with her phone. The timestamps didn't lie. Monday 0600 hours, propofol 500 milliliters. Wednesday 0630 hours, fentanyl 2 milligrams for push. Friday 05 for 5 hours, new propofol drip established. The pattern was so deliberate it might as well have been signed. No medical logic explained the sequence. Patients kept in induced coma required periodic assessment, medication adjustments based on vital signs and neurological response. This wasn't medicine. This was maintenance. This was a man being kept asleep by design. The break room door swung open at 0237 hours. Elena didn't look up. A resident grabbed coffee from the machine, the liquid hissing like a snake. He left. She was alone again. She pulled out her second phone, the one nobody knew she carried, the one with a number that connected to a Pentagon office that officially didn't exist, and photographed the shift reports one more time. Her thumbs moved across the screen with the muscle memory of someone who'd filed operational intelligence reports from caves in Cuna province. Document, verify, escalate. That was the protocol. That had always been the protocol. She slipped the phone back into her scrub pocket beneath her name badge and stood, her movements economical, purposeful. The coffee maker ticked as it cooled. Rain hammered the break room windows like Morse code, like someone trying to warn her. By Thursday, Elena had accessed the pharmaceutical logs. That required a hospital computer in the basement pharmacy, after hours, with credentials she technically didn't have clearance for anymore. But hospital systems didn't change passwords as often as they should, and she'd worked ICU for 4 years. The network remembered her. She sat at a workstation surrounded by boxes of 4 bags and the sharp smell of antiseptic, her fingers moving through screens like she was diffusing something. The digital record of every drug administered to every patient at Seattle General existed in this system, locked behind encryption and audit trails. She found the general's file. Found the orders written in Ashford's digital signature. Found the timestamps. Found the discrepancies that should have triggered a red flag in any competent pharmacy system. Propofol prescribed at quantities that exceeded any medically defensible protocol. Fentanyl refills that bypassed the standard review process. The log showed Ashford had made 17 manual overrides of the automated safety parameters in the past 2 years. 17 times, he'd told the hospital's safeguards system to stand down. Elena photographed each override. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands didn't shake. She'd faced worse, much worse, in contexts where the consequences of failure meant body bags instead of disciplinary reviews. This was just data. This was just evidence. This was just a man being paid to keep a witness unconscious so that whatever he'd hidden could stay hidden. The pharmacy computer hummed its electromagnetic song. She closed the browser windows, cleared the cache, and walked out past the locked medication cabinet where 1,000 ampules of truth sat behind glass. Friday morning, she understood. The realization arrived not like a bolt but like the slow pressure change before a storm. Dr. Ashford was falsifying medication records. Not adjusting them. Not rounding up doses or stretching intervals. Falsifying them. The digital timestamps showed medication administrations at times when the General's vital signs monitors recorded no changes, no response, nothing. Ashford was writing orders that were never filled. Documentation of drugs that were never administered. A pharmaceutical ghost story in the hospital's official record designed to make it look like the General was receiving a medically necessary coma when in reality he was being administered something else entirely. Something not logged. Something off the books. Elena sat in the ICU break room with her coffee and understood that Ashford wasn't just keeping the General asleep. He was keeping him silenced. She'd seen this before in classified briefings and after-action reports. The infrastructure of cover-ups built one false document at a time until the lie became so large it had its own gravity. The General had seen something. Walked in on something. Learned about something that someone powerful wanted buried. Ashford was the mechanism. The hospital was the location. The medication records were the tool. And the General, lying in room for 12 with 2 years of pharmaceutical sedation in his blood, was the problem being solved one injection at a time. Elena thought about her own redacted service record, about the safe house that had collapsed and the asset she'd extracted while mortars screamed overhead, about the way entire operations could be erased by a stamp and a classification level. The General had the rank to know things. The rank to refuse things. The rank to become dangerous if he woke up and started talking. At 0900 hours on Friday morning, Dr. Ashford walked into the hospital administrator's office on the 4th floor and made 2 phone calls. Elena was 2 floors below, restocking supplies in the pediatric ICU, when her supervisor found her. "You've been reassigned pending evaluation," the woman said, her voice apologetic but firm, a nurse just following orders from above. "Mental health clearance required before you can return to patient care. It's administrative. Standard procedure." Elena nodded, her face blank as a security camera. She didn't ask questions. She'd learned long ago that explaining yourself to people with less information was a losing strategy. She turned in her badge, clipped it back on her plain scrubs, and walked to the parking lot where the rain had finally stopped and the asphalt steamed like something trying to breathe. The news that crushed her came not from Ashford but from Rebecca Kincaid's desperate phone call that afternoon. "He's being transferred," Rebecca said, her voice fractured with panic. "Sunday night. The hospital says he's being moved to Cascade Care Facility in Spokane for long-term vegetative care. They say his condition hasn't improved and the protocols he needs aren't available here anymore. Sunday night. 72 hours. Ashford had expedited the transfer papers that morning, the same morning he'd reported Elena to the Psychiatric Evaluation Board. 2 moves. Strategic. Competent. The General would disappear into a care facility where nobody asked questions, where the records didn't matter, where a man in a pharmaceutical coma could stay in a pharmaceutical coma forever and the world would forget he'd ever been awake. Ashford had closed the window. Elena could see it happening in real time, the sequence playing out like a tactic she'd studied in JSOC briefings: isolate the target, remove the witnesses, control the narrative, let time do the rest. Rebecca had requested one final neurological assessment using the family's medical power of attorney, a last attempt to prove her father might recover. The hospital had approved it for Saturday morning at 0900 hours. But then, at 1400 hours on Friday afternoon, the administrator called Rebecca back with new information: the psychiatric evaluation order on Elena Martinez had been escalated. Elena couldn't participate in any patient care pending clearance. The assessment would be conducted by Ashford himself, who'd volunteered to oversee it personally. Rebecca had said yes because she had no choice. Elena understood this without being told. She sat in her apartment and watched the rain return, harder this time, and understood that Ashford had moved 3 pieces in sequence. He'd isolated her. He'd removed her from the general's care. And now he'd positioned himself to control the very assessment that might prove the general could wake up. She had one card left to play. One variable Ashford hadn't accounted for because he didn't know who he was standing next to. Elena pulled out that second phone, the one with the Pentagon number, and stared at it in the darkness of her apartment. Rain hammered the windows like applause. She could make the call. She could escalate this. She could burn down everything she'd built here, the identity, the cover, the 4 years of anonymity, and bring exactly the kind of federal attention to Seattle General that would expose what Ashford was doing. But not yet. Not until she was certain about what the general had seen. Not until she understood what was worth keeping a Marine General in a pharmaceutical coffin for 2 years. The alarm shrieked at 0300 Tuesday. Elena jerked awake in the staff housing dark, that sound cutting through her like shrapnel, not the usual 3-beat code alert, but the long continuous wail that meant catastrophic failure. She was moving before consciousness caught up, pulling on scrubs over her civilian clothes, her hands already knowing what she needed to do before her brain caught the rest up. For flights of stairs in 90 seconds, barefoot through the stairwell because shoes take time. The ICU corridor at 3 a.m. smelled like antiseptic and fear. The night nurse was standing outside the general's room, panic written across her face in real time. Respiration just collapsed. Agonal gasps. I think pneumothorax. His chest, it's pulling in. Elena pushed past without responding. No time for protocol, no time for the attending resident who was still pulling on gloves 2 rooms down. The general's body was doing the work of breathing and losing. Each inhalation pulled his ribs inward like something was crushing him from inside out, and the oxygen sat was already sliding, 92, 88, 84. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, but the air wasn't getting in. Tension pneumothorax didn't wait for residents or crash carts. Tension pneumothorax killed in minutes. Elena ran to her locker. Her fingers found the MRE pouch by muscle memory, the one she kept in the bottom beneath her spare scrubs, meal ready to eat from her last field deployment, 7 years old, the plastic weathered but intact. She tore it open, found the chemical heating element inside, and pulled the packet of plastic sheeting from her own supply, the one she'd been carrying since Bagram like a talisman she couldn't explain. Back to the bedside in 12 seconds. The general's chest was heaving inward with each breath now, and there was no more time for machines. Elena's hands moved on muscle memory that belonged to someone else, to a major in a field hospital outside Bagram with mortars screaming 300 meters away and a blown-out pneumothorax that looked exactly like this. Her fingers positioned the improvised one-way valve, plastic sheeting taped on 3 sides to the general's chest at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the exact placement that would let air escape but not return, that would let his lungs inflate instead of collapse. The tape came from the emergency kit she kept in her jacket pocket, the one she'd been paranoid enough to maintain for 2 years, and her hands were steady as surgical laser as she sealed the 4th edge. The hiss of air escaping through the valve, that single sound telling her the diagnosis was correct, telling her the general's chest was decompressing, telling her oxygen was going to climb. She watched the monitor, 84 becoming 87, becoming 91, becoming 96. His chest was rising and falling normally now, the inward pull stopping like someone had released a pressure valve inside his body. Sinus rhythm holding steady on the monitor. The ventilator finding proper resistance again. 90 seconds. That was all it took. The attending resident burst through the door, Sir Elena's hand still pressed against the improvised seal, saw the general's oxygen saturation climbing, saw the crisis that was no longer a crisis. His face cycled through confusion to comprehension to something that looked like understanding. That's, how did you? Tension pneumothorax, Elena said, her voice level as a cardiac monitor in sinus rhythm. He needed a needle decompression 2 minutes ago. This was faster than waiting. She didn't explain the MRE, didn't explain her hands, didn't explain why she knew the exact anatomical landmarks for an emergency procedure that wasn't in the hospital's protocol manual. The attending resident stepped forward, took over the seal, and Elena stepped back into the shadows where she belonged. Dr. Ashford arrived at 3:33 a.m., still buttoning his shirt, his face pale in the fluorescent light. He saw Elena standing against the back wall, saw the attending resident with his hands on the improvised seal, saw the general's oxygen sat holding steady at 96, and something behind his eyes went very still. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm. He stared at Elena for 11 seconds without speaking, and in those seconds she watched him calculate, watched him understand, watched him realize that she had just saved the life of the only witness who could confirm what he'd done. "Clear the room," Ashford said. Not a request. A command, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all barely contained power and threat. Everyone out except the resident. Elena moved toward the door with the night nurse and the 2 orderlies who'd come to help. She was almost past him when his hand caught her wrist. His fingers were cold. "You," he said quietly, so quietly only she could hear. "This conversation isn't over." She didn't respond. She pulled her wrist free with the casual precision of someone who'd trained for exactly this kind of grip break, and kept walking. The phone calls happened before dawn. She heard about them from Rebecca Kincaid, who came to find her in the break room at 6:15 a.m. with grief written across her face. "He's having you transferred," Rebecca said. "To the psychiatric wing. He's told them you're experiencing stress-induced delusions, that you were making an authorized patient contact, that you accessed files you shouldn't have." Rebecca's voice was steady but her hands were shaking. "He called someone else too. I heard him leave a voicemail. I don't know who. But Elena," his voice, he sounded scared. Scared and angry. By noon, 2 orderlies in dark shirts arrived at the ICU with a hospital administrator Elena had never seen before. "Major," the administrator started, then caught herself. "Ms. Martinez, we're going to need you to come with us for a psychiatric evaluation. It's standard protocol when a staff member exhibits signs of—" "I understand," Elena said quietly. She didn't fight. Didn't argue. Didn't do anything that would give Ashford more ammunition. She just walked with them to the 7th floor, to the psychiatric ward, to a patient room with a window that looked out at Seattle in the late morning light. The door locked behind her with a sound like a cell door in a military brig. That evening, after they'd given her something to help her sleep and she'd palmed it instead of swallowing, Elena made her way to the hospital laundry room. The night shift supervisor was on his break. The room hummed with industrial washers and the smell of bleach and hot water and the 1,000 small ghosts of other people suffering. She pulled her scrubs from her locker one more time. The pale blue uniform that had been her skin for 2 years, the costume she'd worn to disappear completely. Elena folded them with the precision of a flag ceremony, creasing each sleeve with edges sharp enough to draw blood, smoothing the front panel as if she was preparing it for burial. She laid her hospital badge on top of the folded scrubs, the laminated photo of a woman who looked like her but wasn't quite, the woman who had been accepted as nobody important enough to trust with anything real. The broken dog tag chain went across the fabric next, the single tag that had survived her asset extraction from a collapsed safe house in Bagram, the one attached to a chain that had snapped when shrapnel passed through her shoulder and the tag had fallen into her hand still warm. She'd kept it for 7 years, hidden under 3 layers of clothing, a weight against her heart that no one was supposed to know about. The laundry attendant watched in silence as Elena turned to leave, her civilian clothes hanging on her body like borrowed skin. He didn't ask questions. In a hospital, people learned not to ask questions about things that didn't make sense. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that as she walked down the corridor toward the exit, toward whatever came next, she heard Ashford's voice behind her, calm, controlled, already on a phone call. "Yes, she's been secured. Psychiatric hold, documented delusional episode. The general status remains stable but he remains unresponsive. No, I don't anticipate any further complications." She was just a nurse. Just someone who worked here. No one's going to ask too many questions about a psychiatric involuntary hold. Elena didn't stop walking. She didn't turn around. She didn't let him see her face or hear her breathing change. She just kept moving forward into the dark, the way she'd been trained to do a lifetime ago, back when she was still someone with a rank and a purpose and a name that mattered. Back when she was a major. The hospital's routine security clearance update was supposed to be automatic, the kind of bureaucratic box-checking that Elena's supervisor mentioned in passing on a Tuesday morning while she sat in the psychiatric ward dayroom, medicated enough to appear docile, sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening. The system flagged something in her background file that required federal authentication, a classification level that turned the HR director's screen the color of a stopped heart, red, flashing, insistent with warnings that this file could not be accessed without Pentagon-level clearance. Nobody had expected that. Dr. Ashford certainly hadn't expected that, which was why his phone calls to unnamed contacts went unanswered by Wednesday afternoon, why his carefully constructed narrative of a delusional nurse was about to collide with a truth too classified to bury. The general's daughter Rebecca had never stopped visiting, had never stopped reading her father's chart despite the locked ward restrictions, and when she saw Elena being escorted back to her assigned room by 2 orderlies on Tuesday evening, something in her shifted. She waited until the nurses changed shifts, then she walked into the hospital records office where her father's medical file was kept, pulled the original admission papers, and saw the medication orders, all bearing timestamps that didn't match pharmacy records, all signed by Dr. Ashford during shifts when he explicitly wasn't supposed to be administering treatment. She photographed every page. By Wednesday morning, she'd contacted a lawyer. By Wednesday afternoon, she'd contacted someone higher. The security clearance red flag triggered a Department of Defense automated inquiry, which escalated to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, which recognized the name Elena Martinez from a protection order filed 7 years prior by the Pentagon's Office of General Counsel. Somewhere in a secure database at the Navy Yard in Washington, a file that hadn't been opened in 3 years suddenly had new access timestamps. Within 4 hours, a request went out to Seattle General's IT department, pull all security footage from the psychiatric ward. Cross-reference with medication administration records. Preserve everything. It wasn't a request. It was a command, classified at a level that made hospital administrators move with the precise urgency of people who understood federal obstruction penalties. Elena was folding her hospital-issued blanket, a small act of ceremony, of precision, the way soldiers fold flags at funerals, when her room door opened and Rebecca walked in with her phone already extended. On the screen was a PDF of Elena's military file, and Rebecca's voice was shaking as she read aloud the first line, Major. Her voice broke on the single syllable, the weight of what it meant suddenly visible in the tremor of her hands. Major Elena Martinez. Combat Medical Officer, Joint Special Operations Command. Rebecca scrolled down slowly, as if each word might change what Elena had been forced to become, and she kept reading, deployed 5 tours. Bagram Airfield Primary Station. Call sign Angel 6. Classified Operation Record. Protected Witness Status. The next morning, a nurse she'd never seen before pushed a medication cart into the psychiatric ward's hallway, and she asked the charge nurse, quietly, just loud enough to be overheard, "Is Major Martinez still in room 7? The nurse had paused at that word, Major. By lunchtime, 3 staff members had accessed Elena's background file. By 3 p.m., the entire psychiatric unit knew something massive was wrong with the narrative they'd been given about the delusional nurse on their ward. By 4 p.m., a Navy SEAL commander walked through the hospital's main entrance in dress blues, his presence alone enough to make security reposition themselves, and he went directly to Elena's room where Rebecca was sitting beside her on the bed. He saluted first, which Elena didn't expect, a fist-to-chest motion that sounded like a heartbeat in the sterile silence. Major Martinez, I'm Commander Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Command. I'm here to inform you of something. His voice was the kind that didn't need to be loud to fill a room. It had the timbre of someone who'd given orders in sandstorms and darkness and seen them followed without question. Let me read your record. He pulled a classified file from his briefcase, the cover bearing a red stripe and the words eyes only, and he opened it where anyone walking past the open door could see. Bronze Star with Valor, he said, his voice carrying down the hallway. A nurse passing in the corridor stopped, turned back, listening. Silver Star. Another staff member slowed their pace. Second Silver Star. The chart felt heavy in his hands, the weight of decades compressed into pages. Purple Heart. And a Navy Cross for the extraction at the collapsed safe house in Sanjan Valley, 2014. By the time 2 FBI agents arrived, the hospital grapevine had already done half their work. Elena's file had been shared across the unit staff chat. A young resident who'd watched her fold her scrubs that first week and thought about how careful she'd been, how precise, he'd suddenly realized that precision wasn't the habit of a delusional woman, it was the habit of someone trained to function under conditions that required absolute control. The agents moved through the hospital like men who'd done this before, who knew exactly where to find the falsified medication records and the pharmacy timestamps that contradicted them. One agent, Special Agent Reeves, his credentials already identifying him as NCIS, stood in the hallway outside Elena's door and spoke loud enough for the gathered staff to hear. Dr. Ashford knowingly maintained a false coma to silence a federal witness. Major Martinez's protected status is now compromised due to her exposure. This is a national security matter. The words hung in the psychiatric unit's fluorescent lit air like an accusation that couldn't be walked back. Somewhere in hospital administration, someone was already pulling Dr. Ashford's office access records, which would show him reviewing General Kincaid's medication charts at 3 in the morning on dates when the man's sedation hadn't been medically indicated. Somewhere, someone was calculating the hours he'd spent falsifying records, the deliberate cruelty of keeping a human being in chemical imprisonment, the mathematics of corruption. Thursday evening, Dr. Ashford sat across from news anchor Diana Chen on Channel 7's evening broadcast, his media training evident in the crisp white shirt he'd chosen, the way his jacket was tailored to suggest competence and authority. Major Martinez, despite her service, displayed clear signs of post-traumatic psychological impairment that made her a question to patient safety. He began, his voice smooth as anesthesia flowing through and full line. He'd rehearsed this narrative for 2 days, building the architecture of his defense one careful phrase at a time. My duty as chief of medicine was to protect. Diana pressed her earpiece. The camera caught the exact moment her face changed, the second her eye shifted from reporters' interest to something sharper, something that looked like the satisfaction of watching a trap spring shut. Dr. Ashford, I'm being told we have the Secretary of the Navy on the line with a statement regarding your conduct. The screen split, on one side, Ashford's carefully composed expression beginning to fracture, on the other, Secretary Richard Morrison's face, steady and official and without mercy. Dr. Ashford knowingly suppressed a federal investigation by keeping a key witness, Marine General Robert Kincaid, in a medically unnecessary coma for 2 years while destroying evidence of a major defense contract fraud scheme. The Secretary's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the kind that couldn't be challenged in a live television interview. He falsified medical records, administered contraindicated sedatives, and when a decorated combat medical officer discovered his crimes, he weaponized the psychiatric system to silence her. 2 million people watched Ashford's hands begin to tremble. 2 million watched the color drain from his face like saline draining from a line. The FBI has evidence of $14 million in kickbacks paid to Dr. Ashford by Titan Medical Supply in exchange for exclusive contracts and General Kincaid's silence, Morrison continued, and what happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. Ashford stood up. His microphone was still live. The camera followed him as he tried to walk off stage, capturing the stumble in his gait, the way his hands shook as he tried to steady himself against a studio door that suddenly seemed very far away. Diana's voice came through, Dr. Ashford, do you have a response? But there was no response, only the sound of a man watching his entire architecture collapse in front of 2 million witnesses, only the particular silence that comes when someone realizes there's nowhere left to run. By midnight, the viral video had been shared 847,000 times. Seattle General's board had terminated him for cause. Federal marshals had executed search warrants on his home and office. The $14 million in kickbacks were already being traced through shell corporations and offshore accounts. The medication records that he'd thought were safely buried under layers of administrative protection were suddenly evidence in a federal obstruction investigation. 6 months later, when Elena walked into the Marine barracks at San Diego wearing her dress blues for the first time in a decade, when the commandant pinned the Defense Superior Service Medal to her uniform in front of an auditorium full of active duty officers and military families, when she stepped to the microphone and said, "Only heroes walk among us." Sometimes in scrubs saving lives in the dark, she already knew that Dr. Ashford was working night security at Seattle General, that he was watching real medical professionals save lives in the hospital he'd corrupted, that his name tag now read Security Guard Ashford instead of Chief of Medicine, and that every single person who walked past him knew exactly who he'd been and exactly what he'd done. She'd passed him in the hallway once, on a Tuesday evening when she'd gone back to visit General Kincaid during his physical therapy. Ashford was standing by the medication lockers, restocking supplies, his eyes dropping the moment he saw her approaching. She was holding the general's hand on one side, Rebecca on the other, the broken dog tag chain finally repaired and gleaming at her collar, no longer a symbol of what she'd lost, but of what she'd reclaimed. She didn't say anything to Ashford. She didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any accusation could ever be, the kind of silence that comes when someone understands that they've lost everything and the person who cost them their career is walking past in full daylight, whole again, her identity restored, her honor intact, and nothing they do will ever change that. If you've made it this far, you know that the quiet person in the room is often the one holding it all together. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes nobody sees coming. Like this video if Elena's journey resonated with you. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Let's talk about it.